Welcome to the alligatorSports podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Hernandez, and for the first time ever, it's on video. Instead of on Spotify, we're actually going to have it on our website as well as on our YouTubes. But, of course, with the sports podcast, we talk a lot about the UF athletics, and this time around, it's football season. So we have a great treat with us. Joining me right now is the sports editor, Jackson Reyes, as well as the sports assistant editor, Topher Adams. Guys, thank you for joining in.
Thank you for having us.
Now, this Gator team, it's only 9 returning starters from last year's roster. This is absolutely a new team for the Gators, and Billy Napier going to his second year in the helm. Topher, you had an article that came out recently, not only talking about the quarterback room, but as well as the offensive line. Tell just a little bit about the offense. What can people expect?
Yeah, thanks again, Brandon, for hosting. I'm excited. Podcast better than ever. But to talk about this Gators offense, I think first it's important to note that Billy Napier, at his heart, is a quarterback's coach and an offensive coordinator. That's where he was at Arizona State before he got the Louisiana job. That's where he was at Clemson before he even went to Alabama. He was their offensive coordinator right at the beginning of the Dabo Swinney years. So when looking at Florida's roster construction under Napier, I think it's important to look that the offense is going to take on his identity. I mean, his offensive coordinator is Rob Sale, but Rob Sale is really the offensive line coach. He's not an offensive coordinator in the traditional sense. He's not calling plays. Billy Napier calls the plays. It's his offense. That being said, it's a very physical offense. He wants to be physical. He wants to run the ball. That's what they're all about. And I think that is reflected on this year's team because the strength of the team is really the running back room, which is the only area with some real returning veteran depth,
Yes.
and the offensive line, which has a lot of new starters, but a lot of these guys are really talented prospects, really talented players. So talking about the running back room, it's Montrell Johnson and Travis Etienne, both players close to 1,000 yards last year, dynamic, game-breaking players. Montrell Johnson's kind of that thunder power back, big dude, like 6 foot, 220, big, strong tailback. Travis Etienne, explosive, dynamic, quick feet, shifty hips. They're running behind a big offensive line. Osiris Torrance was an All-American last year for the Gators. He's off to the NFL. But they brought in Micah Mazuka, who was one of the highest-rated offensive linemen in the Big 12, Baylor last year. He slots in there at left guard. Austin Barber was a freshman All-American tackle a season ago for the Gators. He should be a full-time starter at left tackle. And then the rest of the offensive line is a mix of experienced guys like Kingsley Iguakin, who I think is his third-year starting at center, which is a really important position to have some experience. Richie Leonard has played all kinds of positions as a reserve lineman. And the transfers, Damian George from Alabama, talented kid. Lindell Hudson from Florida International, one of the best Group of 5 transfers as well. So really, that's the identity of this offense. And really the identity of this whole team is those front 5 guys across the offensive line, mauling, physical run blocking, creating rushing lanes for Montrell and Travis Etienne. And that's what this offense is all about. We can talk more about the wide receivers. We can talk about Graham Mertz in the quarterback room, but really the bread and butter and where Florida's going to make their money is in that rushing game and with those 5 guys up front.
But Topher, because you were talking a lot about the running back room, and of course the offensive line is a huge part of any football team in the SEC especially, but the quarterback room. I mean, from the transfer, Graham Mertz has been the most intriguing one out of Wisconsin. More than 30 collegiate starts in Division I football, and from what we've seen so far from in training camp, he has his own style of game. However, what can we expect from him? Will it be something close to Anthony Richardson, something similar, or just an entirely new ballgame?
Yeah, I mean, he's a completely different type of quarterback than Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson is a 1A, unique, superhuman athlete. He is Cam Newton reincarnate. He is Vince Young reincarnate. He's that kind of guy. That type of playmaker, that type of rusher, that type of deep passing ability. Graham Mertz has none of that. And that's not necessarily a slight to Graham Mertz. It's more a praise of Anthony Richardson's superhuman physical abilities.
Oh, yes, yeah.
But what Graham Mertz is a super effective and experienced game manager, a guy who can execute the offense, understand what he needs to do, keep the football out of trouble, and make enough plays to move the offense. Billy Napier's offense does not ask someone to be a superstar. It does not ask you to be Caleb Williams. It does not ask you to be Drake May. It just asks you to understand the defense, to get the ball to your playmakers on time and in rhythm, and don't turn the ball over. Graham Mertz, he had some issues with turnovers at Wisconsin, but when you look at what he was dealing with Wisconsin, It's one of the worst receiving cores in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
It's probably the worst offensive scheme in the Big Ten, where they're running I formation, A gap power like it's 1992. They still think Ron Dane's back there. It's vintage stuff. There's nothing he can do in that offense to elevate things. Pat Mahomes would struggle to consistently execute in that offense because it's just so old-fashioned and it's so hard for a quarterback to get any kind of traction in that type of system. He comes here to Gainesville, and I'm not saying that Billy Napier is Lincoln Riley or anything with a air raid spread set. It's very pro-style, very run-the-ball heavy, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But it frees him up a little bit, and Florida has some really exciting playmakers, especially some of these young guys, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. I think Graham Mertz, while he might not have to be the player a lot of Florida fans want, he's not exciting the way Anthony Richardson's exciting. He's not exciting the way Tim Tebow was exciting back in the day, but he can be extremely efficient, and he can play a lot of winning football, is I think what you can expect. He's not going to make Florida worse in any way, I don't think it is.
Yeah, and just like to add off of that, I think the toughest part, for Florida fans going into the season, transitioning from Anthony Richardson to Graham Mertz, is you kind of just see that missed opportunity with Richardson, where he's just such a freak athlete, like you mentioned, the second coming of a guy like Cam Newton. And with a guy that talented on your team, and the team went 6-7 last year, and obviously, that's not solely on Richardson. It has to do with so many other factors. Talent players, injured players at other positions, things like that. Just a very difficult schedule overall. And you look at some of these other guys, like you mentioned, Cam Newton, Tim Tebow, where it's like, they were superstar athletes like Anthony Richardson was, but they had so many years under his belt. That was AR's first season, so transitioning from that to Graham Mertz is definitely a big change. But with Graham Mertz, I think he's a guy who is going to be a very solid game manager. He's going to be able to make the right throws. He's going to be able to protect the ball, even though obviously he struggled with that. But as you mentioned, he was playing under different circumstances at Wisconsin with just the schemes they run offensively. I think he's going to have guys like Ricky Pearsall, who, Ricky Pearsall may not be the best wide receiver in the SEC, but I think he's someone who can, get open. He's able to make the right plays. He's able to just sort of provide a security blanket for Graham Mertz as the season goes on. And then obviously he's going to have Montreal and Trevor Etienne in the backfield, guys who he's going to be able to just dump it off to, who can break it off and make a big play, just because they're such talented players. So obviously it's going to be a big change going from Richardson to Graham Mertz, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be a major downgrade where, Florida's going to be floundering out there against these SEC opponents just because Graham Mertz is the quarterback. I think they're going to be able to compete game in and game out against the SEC's best.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the recent history of college football in the transfer portal, one-time transfer rule era, we've seen a lot of quarterbacks go from challenging season situations where they were among the worst starters in their leagues and then immediately become like star players. You think of Washington and Oregon, like Michael Penix Jr., a terrible second season in Indiana, injuries, super inefficient football, goes to Washington in a system he's more comfortable with, Heisman Trophy contender. Bo Nix was a meme at Auburn. Literally, he was a meme at Auburn because it was just such a dysfunctional mess his whole career there. He goes to Oregon, gets into a good situation that fits his skill set, Heisman contender. Again, I'm not saying Graham Mertz is going to be that level because I don't think he has the skill set or Florida's system is set up to put him in a position to be that kind of guy.
Right.
But we always see so often when a guy with that kind of experience and that kind of talent transfers to a situation that fits his skill set better, which I think Florida certainly does, they can be a much more effective player. And again, Graham Mertz, top 100 recruit in high school game All-American. He has the talent to be an elite player in college football, and he can show that in a system that I think is more tailored to what he does best. And I think, you mentioned Ricky Pearsall.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm out of line saying this might be the best receiving core he's ever played with by far.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's not even close.
And just to add on to that too is obviously just as another example, but more applicable to the SEC. You mentioned Bo Nix going from Auburn to Oregon, and maybe a naysayer says, well, that just means he couldn't do it in the SEC. You look at a guy like Jaden Daniels. His first couple seasons at Arizona State, obviously he's showing promise, showing potential. But that Arizona State teams, they never really reached the potential they needed. He goes to LSU. They make the SEC championship game in his first season there. And again, you mentioned the Penix and Bo Nix comparisons. I'm not saying that Graham Mertz is going to be like that. I'm not necessarily saying that Florida's going to make the SEC championship this season. But I do think Mertz has the potential to make some major improvements off his Wisconsin tenure, just because he's going to be with better offensive weapons, a better system, and overall I think he's just going to have a better season with another year under his belt.
Yeah, and also I thought it was kind of funny. You guys talked a lot about teams like Washington, Oregon. The Conference of Champions is probably no more of the Pac-12.
Oh, rest in peace.
But there is also some sort of connection, and especially with Daniels of LSU, which is considered from a lot of members of the media as one of the quarterbacks to look after in the SEC this coming fall.
Yeah.
But let's go away from the offense for a second. Let's go into defense. Jackson, you have an article that's right now up on alligator.org, where the majority of our articles are on, and of course our coverage. But you talked a lot about the safeties. Tell us a little bit about that secondary for the Gators. How's it looking like so far for UF?
Looking at that secondary so far, I mean, top to bottom, the entire team's pretty young this season, just looking at every single room. But I think that's more true than anywhere else, looking at the secondaries, the corners and the safeties. Mm-hmm. You look at the cornerback room, they have Jadarius Perkins, he's a senior. They have a redshirt junior, Jalen Kimber. But other than that, it's a lot of freshmen, it's a lot of sophomores. A lot of guys who just did not start last season. Last season, especially at the safety position, you had Rashad Torrance and Trey Dean starting every game essentially.
And they were multi-year starters as well. Lots of experience with those two guys.
They're both gone. You saw a couple players leaving the transfer portal. I think it was of the 9 players who started games last season, 5 of them have left the program, whether it's through the draft or the transfer portal. So not only are they returning a lot of young faces, but guys who just have not played a lot of games. I look at that secondary, especially looking at corner. I look at Jason Marshall Jr. He was a 5-star when he came out of high school. Came to Florida with a lot of hype. He's entering his 3rd year. He's going to be a junior. He's started a decent amount of games. I think he started the most games at the corner position for the Florida Gators. And I think he could take a major leap this year. He's obviously shown some flashes, but I don't think he's been anywhere near being one of the best corners in the conference. But I do think another year under his belt, a new scheme with Austin Armstrong as the defensive coordinator, we could definitely see a leap from him. Looking elsewhere, I look at a guy like Jalen Kimber. I remember I spoke to the sports editor at the Georgia student newspaper, the Red and Black, and he talked about when Kimber joined them, he was hyped up to be this guy who was going to be the opposite corner to Kaylee Ringo. Then obviously, he's off to the NFL, and Kimber transferred here. He had a little bit of flashes last season playing in games. He had that pick 6 against USF last season, but I think he has the potential again to be that opposite corner to Jason Marshall and also take a leap. And looking at that safety room, there's 2 guys who really stand out to me. That first one is the transfer they got in, R.J. Moan from Michigan. He started, I think, every game last season for Michigan. That's someone who was able to start for a playoff team. And that experience alone is going to be huge for a safety that really has not started many games at all. You look across the board and it's a lot of, not just young faces, but guys who've been on the team but have just not gotten the playing time. And then I look at the other guy, Kamari Wilson. He was another guy, 4-star. I think he was 5-star on some websites coming out of high school. He started 2 games last season, got a lot of playing time just because of that safety room being so thin. And he's a guy who, again, freshman year showed some flashes, but maybe wasn't, blowing people's socks off. But coaches and players are already talking about him as like one of the leaders on the team. And I think that alone speaks volumes. Guy comes in here, he's a sophomore. He realizes how he realizes how young the team is and, how inexperienced it is just in terms of starts and guys who've played games. He's been able to step up and be that guy for Florida. I think that's going to be vital for this season if he can continue that, throughout the regular season.
Yeah, I mean, and before you go, Topher, because I do want to say especially the experience in the SEC is a huge part. I know from, going outside of Florida, Alabama, Nick Saban talks about experience being a huge part. In kind of a weird way, he doesn't have that for his own program right now. Alabama, a lot of freshmen, sophomore, young guys. So Florida's not the only one dealing with this sort of issue, but of course, for Florida fans who are, on the recruiting side of things, this is where they can see Billy Napier's first recruitment class go in and really make work, such as Wilson. But for Topher, for you, the defense of this team, is there anybody we should be looking at, or just a group of guys we should be looking at?
Yeah, there's a couple of guys who could be like dudes, like all SEC, all American, first round drafted kind of dudes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Jason Marshall. He hasn't really popped yet, but the talent's there. He can be a premium number 1 corner in the SEC. He could absolutely be the next, name's escaping me, on the Bills.
Kyrie Elam?
He could be the next Kyrie Elam.
Oh.
He could be the next C.J. Henderson. Like he could be that kind of guy. He has that type of skill. I think the thing about cornerback that's so tricky is that it's a hard position to notice, because if you're a really good cornerback, you don't notice.
Yeah.
It's like offensive line, because your job is to shut somebody down, and you're only going to notice if that guy had a bunch of catches. So
yeah, that's true.
if you don't hear Jason Marshall Jr.'s name a lot, he's probably doing his job really well.
No, yeah, absolutely.
He's a guy, like, this is a money year for him. 3rd year, 5-star guy. He has a big year. He could be a draft pick. He could leave Florida this year. The other guy who is that level of talent is Princely Umanmielen. I swear I will figure out his pronunciation at some point. My apologies, Princely. He's a great player. He has every physical tool in the book. Super long arms, super physical. I think he's like 6'5", something like that. Big dude. Pass rushing moves. Good run support player. He's a smart player. He's the guy for Florida's front seven. If they have a guy who could just like wreck games as a pass rusher, who can just blow up plays in the backfield, which is something I think you see a lot of times with really good SEC teams. I think the best example in recent history is Will Anderson in Alabama.
Yeah.
2 years ago, when he was, I think, a redshirt freshman or a true sophomore or whatever, he was one of the best. He's probably the best player in the country. He should have won the Heisman. I'll say that. Will Anderson, that year he had like 20 tackles for loss, should have won the Heisman Trophy. He was an animal.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Princely's going to be that. I don't think anybody's ever again going to be that. But he's that kind of guy. You want a more modest Florida comp. Think maybe like Jabari Zuniga a few years ago. He was a fringe NFL guy at kind of that big end spot, a big time pass rusher. Princely has all the talent in the world. He could be a 1st-round draft pick. He's an explosive athlete on the end. And then I think a couple other guys I just want to shout out real quick. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about Desmond Watson.
No, I
think
he's
that guy.
He's definitely one of the faces of the team, kind of regardless of how good he is, just because he's such a unique physical presence. 6'5", like 430 pounds.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever he's listed at now.
It's an absolute human.
He's
He's a big guy.
huge. He's actually really good, and every time we talk to him in the media, he seems like a delightful guy. So you can have a lot worse as the face of your program, but he just takes up so much space on the inside, and he's deceptively quick, and he moves well for his size. A couple of new guys I'm sure you can talk about too on that defensive line, like Cam Jackson, Caleb Banks. I think it's a talented defense. I think it'll be interesting to see how many of these young guys take a step, because there's a lot of guys. I'm looking at this 2 deep right now. There's a lot of sophomores and freshmen. There's a lot of young guys in key spots. So we'll see who really pops and who can take that leap, especially with a new defensive coordinator. But it'll be interesting.
Yeah, and just looking at that defense too, I look at a lot of these young faces, and obviously Billy Napier has talked about how there's going to be a lot of opportunities, especially at the safety position, the defensive line position, where a lot of these younger guys are going to get opportunities to play. He's raved about guys like Jordan Castell, Jack Pyburn, Chris McClellan, these guys, freshmen and sophomores who, a guy like Chris McClellan, for example, I keep saying this, but they were shown playing time last season. They showed flashes, just because some of these rooms have been so thin in terms of just the depth, that they're going to have the potential to really pop. And you have so many young guys that you hope that Billy Napier is able to properly evaluate the talent of these guys he's bringing into the program, and get some of these guys to really pop off as the season goes on. Because obviously experience is so important in the SEC, but you are able to see some of those young guys who are going to be able to take that step immediately. I look at a team like LSU, a guy like Harold Perkins, who he was one of the best players in the whole country as a freshman, and going to a second year, he's going to be so important for that LSU defense if they want to compete for the playoff. And again, similar to the Mertz comps that we were making, I'm not saying that some of these freshmen are going to be like Harold Perkins. Where they're immediately some of the best players in the country. But I think that there's definitely the talent there for these guys to make an immediate impact and, improve for a defense team for a team that defensively ranked towards the bottom of the SEC.
They've been bad for a couple of seasons
category.
Too. And I think one more thing I'll add to this before we move on. There's something you'll hear a lot, especially if you live in SEC media circles. If you're good enough, you're old enough. if you're young, just because you're a young player, just because you're a freshman or sophomore, doesn't mean you can't be the best player at your position. Doesn't mean you can't be the best player in a conference. So you think about guys right now who have a shot to play in the 2 deep. Think a guy like Kelby Collins, one of the best recruits on the team. Think a guy like Devin Moore. We haven't mentioned him yet. He played a couple games as a true freshman last year before an injury.
Yeah.
I think Devin Moore could be a real factor at cornerback. He looked really nice. He was one of those first additions in Napier's recruiting class when he got hired from Louisiana.
Right.
He's another guy who could really take off.
Jackson,
Jakeem Jackson, he's a true freshman. He's a lot of talent. So I think I don't want to say boom or bust. That feels a little too extreme.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely a world where these young players hit, and Florida's defense, basically like that, is much better than it was last year or the year before.
And at the very least, too, I think, obviously, Billy Napier, he's been bringing in his guys through the transfer portal. He's been putting a big emphasis on recruiting these guys, 4-star guys to the program. He's got a couple 5-star commits for the incoming class, 2024. And he's just really trying to build that depth. Obviously, unless you're getting the top guys every single time in the transfer portal, it's hard to be good immediately with high-level talent who's experienced already. So he's really trying to start from the ground up, bring in these guys who he thinks are going to make an impact for, however long they're at UF.
And you look at the recruiting rankings, it's just continuing this year. I mean, they're on pace to have their best recruiting class in a decade.
Yeah.
So it's really about just building slowly through the recruiting to fill out that roster. Because it's good to have a great starting lineup. You can have the best starting lineup in the country, but the reason that Georgia has won 2 national championships in a row, the reason that Alabama has won 5 national championships under Nick Saban is because their second string is better than every other team in the country starters. It's that depth, that premium depth that makes great teams in the SEC and national championship caliber teams, which Florida wants to be, and that's still going to take a while. We'll see how long it takes and if Florida can get to that level again.
Yes, and of course, a deep bench in any position is probably the best thing in football, any sport you really think about it. But now we talk a little bit more about Gators, but let's go now and talk about the opponent for the Gators on Thursday. The Utah Utes, the number 14th team in the nation according to the AP poll. And this is a team where the Gators played last year, week 1, in a really tight matchup where not a lot of people saw the Gators coming out in that game. And that wasn't a very electric game where the Gators ended up winning that one in a close one. But it's a little bit of a different feel right now going into year 2 with Billy Napier, and especially for Utah, who have their own problems in the quarterback room. For any of you guys, tell us a little bit about what's going on in Utah right now in Cam Rising.
I don't even know if the full-time Utah people can tell you what's really going on with Cam Rising. He's been in and out of training camp the last couple of weeks. He's been banged up. I've heard that some of their backup quarterbacks have been injured as well. They did release their official 2-deep depth chart a couple of like a whole week early for the Florida game. And Cam Rising was listed as a starting quarterback. We will see who takes snaps for the Utes, but Cam Rising, that could be a game-deciding injury because Cam Rising is maybe the single most experienced quarterback in all of college football. I mean, that guy has played a ton of football for Utah the last few years.
And especially he's a guy too who very talented passer, and he's has that experience to really pick apart a defense, and on top of that, he could kill you with your legs too.
He killed Florida with his legs last year. He had 60 rushing yards.
And again, he doesn't look physically like the type where it's like you're gonna get over 200, over 150 yards on the legs.
Yeah.
But in reality, he has a good 40.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's kind of like functionally good athlete who just makes plays with his feet when he needs to. And that was killing Florida last year. I just recently rewatched that game, and the amount of key third downs where he just beats you with his legs because he knows when to tuck in and run against man coverage.
Yeah.
Or he knows how to fit it into a tight zone, zone coverage. He's just a great all-around football player. If he's in the game, it'll be extremely tough for Florida to get anything going in Salt Lake. But I mean, even if he's not available, Utah's such a tough team, man. But
Yeah, it'll be interesting for sure. I know, I believe it was Whittingham or somebody said that it could come down to the final 10 minutes before the game starts to announce if Rising's going to play or not. I don't know how much of that was just hyperbole to, try and scare Florida off from their scouting, or if that really is the case. But, right now he's listed as QB1, and I feel like as we get closer and closer to game day, it is looking like Cam Rising will play in some capacity, whether or not he will be 100% healthy. I think that could be a big factor too. If he's playing and he's not 100% health, like you mentioned, he killed Florida in the run game.
Yeah.
If he's not 100% healthy, he may not trying to be take off. He may not be trying to take off as much. Going forward against that Florida defense. And, if Florida's defense is able to improve, like we've been talking about them potentially doing with the players they brought in with the new defensive coordinator, then, they might be able to cause injured Cam Rising some fits defensively.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, when I think about Florida's defense, especially what Armstrong said to the media throughout the spring camps and everything in the middle, he talks about the aggression that this team will have. And I think the pass rush for Florida will be a huge point of emphasis on Thursday. When we look at really, Cam Rising and his injuries throughout his career, it's something to really bewilder because his leg's been hurt, back's been hurt, upper body.
He's a football guy.
He's a football guy.
He is a football guy.
He's absolutely a football guy. But for Napier's side of things, this is his second time going against Utah, and this is going to be a different venue in Salt Lake.
Hopefully he'll be there. We'll see what the weather is.
So
we'll see what the weather is.
Barring a tropical storm turned hurricane, we will see.
Yes, for those who do not know, we are recording this Sunday prior to the Thursday game, so we are still keeping an eye on the weather on tropical storm. Weather's been really weird. I mean, there's even hurricane in California? I never heard of anything like
Weird
that.
year. Weird year.
Really weird year.
Weird time to be alive.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, but Rice-Eccles Stadium, it's going to be the venue.
Home of the Stallions.
Home of the Stallions.
Don't forget, AAF legends.
Now, this isn't really an SEC venue. It's, I would probably have to say, around that of 45 to 55,000 people in that venue. But what was Napier saying, if he did say anything about the venue and just that matchup against Utah in Salt Lake?
Yeah, I know him talking about it, and then obviously Pearsall was also asked about it because he's played in that stadium when he was at Arizona State. They respect the environment. It is one of the better ones in the Pac-12.
It's good. It's good venue.
51,000 is smaller than the Swamp, but it's still able to get loud, still to get rowdy. And I know they boasted a really good record there.
Yeah, I do not know how many times they've not lost at home.
I want to say Pearsall mentioned. I did not fact check this, but he said they haven't lost at home in 2 seasons. So
yeah, that's true.
Again, I have no fact that's true.
Yeah,
so,
they have been 2 times Pac-12 champs.
Yep.
I mean, it's a very tough road.
So clearly it's a tough environment. And then obviously, going to Utah, Napier was asked about playing in the altitude. Again, we don't know what the hurricane is going to do in terms of affecting their travel. But the plan as of Sunday is they leave Wednesday to get to Salt Lake City, play the game Thursday, and then get out Friday. And they were asked why he wants to do that, and he talked about it. He's talked to people who work in the NFL who are acquainted to working with altitude. Flying to places like Denver to play NFL games, and the science shows that it takes about 10 days to acclimate to the altitude. So it's better just to get in, get out, and try and reduce the effects as much as possible. Just because obviously we're less than 7 days to the game day. Even if they flew tomorrow, then it just gives them more time to have the altitude effect rather than just trying to get in and get out.
I mean, that is such a unique issue for Florida. I mean, how many times has this team played across the Mississippi? Ever. I mean, it's not very often. This team does not go to the West Coast. I genuinely do not know the last time they played a regular season game west of Texas.
Yeah.
It's been have never happened. I don't know. I would have to check the notes. It's such a weird matchup, and especially elevation. That's just something they never deal with. And I can think of so many times watching a Denver Broncos game, and you see visiting players have the extra oxygen on the sidelines because it's just such a unique element. So yeah, maybe the atmosphere isn't the same level of intense as LSU or Texas A&M.
Yeah.
But the physical conditions, it's such a unique home field advantage for Utah in this game, which Florida's really up against it in that sense. So I think that's really a heavy preparation for Billy Napier, who does seem like a guy who likes to prepare as much as he can, to talk to NFL people, talk to those connections, and try and come up with the best game plan to handle this unique travel situation the best they can. I say something we haven't mentioned yet about this that kind of bodes in Florida's favor, and maybe this is reading the trends, reading the tea leaves a little bit more than it is actual analysis. But historically, under Kyle Whittingham, Utah is kind of a slow starter. They've been really excellent the last 4 years or so. But they've had some hiccups in the early season play. I mean, last year they lost to Florida, and Florida was an okay team last year, but it's a 6-7 Florida team, and Utah was the Pac-12 champions, right? They've lost to San Diego State in an early season game a couple years ago. They have a tendency to start the season kind of slow, kind of sluggish, which makes sense because they're a team that's built on physicality, dominating you on the trenches, and those teams play their best football in November. So if Florida was playing Utah at Rice-Eccles on like November 14th, Florida has no chance. They have no chance. They're not going to win that football game.
No,
but
different story.
On August 31st, it's a lot more gettable. They're much more gettable team on week 1 than they are in like week 12.
And adding on to that too, adding on to that too real quick too is especially, obviously it's not every game once it hits that time, but, Florida will have to deal with the altitude, but, the weather seems to be pretty similar to how it is now. It looks, I've checked about 85, 86 degrees, Sometimes they get to that winter, you're playing in the snow. And that's where when's the last time Florida played in the snow? I can't think of a time when it's happened.
I can't even imagine a Florida team playing in the snow, to be honest with you.
Maybe one of the Missouri road trips will have the snow's going to storm one of these years.
Yeah, but this is definitely a flip of the script, though, because last year was about playing in the swamp for Utah. We saw players throwing up Gatorade, a lot of cramping. This will be more elevation, oxygen. What's conditioning like for Florida? But now talking about the matchup, let's go into a little bit about predictions we have. When I'm looking at this team, and especially for Florida, last year I had a prediction of the Gators going 9-3.
Okay.
I saw the talent. What do you think about Cyrus? What do you think about Richardson? What do you think about Ventrell Miller? None of those guys are there. Sure. The veteranship of the team itself, there is pieces, but as we mentioned before previously in the podcast, there's also inexperience with that.
100%.
This is going to be a Gator team that's going to be tested in an atmosphere they're unaware of, an atmosphere where, of course, a lot of them will be their first time playing in a road in the not West Coast, but I have to say in a place where the time zone is definitely going to be an issue. The air is going to be an issue. Everything in the middle of that Mississippi River, whatever you want to call some parts of the Lone State, Texas, there's going to be some issues, all right? So this is going to be a game where I think the Gators are going to have a rough, bumpy start, but I really do like Utah in this game. I think that, of course, we don't know what's going on with Cam Rising. We don't really know exactly what his injuries is like, how he's going to perform with those injuries. But if the only thing we're talking about for a two-time Pac-12 champ is the quarterback situation, there's not a lot of things to worry about for Utah. I'm thinking that Florida has a rough start to the season.
Yeah, I look at the matchup. It's definitely a tough one for Florida. Utah's a very talented team, like you mentioned, back-to-back Pac-12 champions. They're an extremely talented team. Talked about them. They did lose some starters from last season, but they're still going to return a pretty experienced squad, including quarterback Cam Rising, even though he may not be able to play. We'll see once game time hits. But I look at that matchup, and I see Florida going in, and I feel like they'll definitely be able to keep it competitive. As we mentioned, talking about that offense, I think Graham Mertz will be solid. I look at Ricky Pearsall. He's played in this environment before. He's been to Rice-Eccles, I think, twice, playing there at Arizona State. So I don't know how much the altitude will affect him, even though he's been in Florida for about over a year now. So just looking at that, and then looking at the running back duo of Etienne and Montrell Johnson, I don't think Florida will have a problem really moving the ball against Utah. Especially since, as you mentioned, Utah's a team that kind of has its slower start to seasons. I think if Florida can punch them in the mouth early, not to use a cliche phrase, but how to describe it, then I think they can have some success. And especially, it'll be a young defense, and it really can go one of two ways. Obviously Utah might have an experience and might be able to just move the ball at will against Florida. Those young guys getting playing time for the first time may struggle. Or, the adrenaline of the moment, getting to go in their first action, they might be able to step up and keep up with the Utah players. I see it being a very close game, but ultimately I think Utah pulls out a very close matchup.
Yeah. When I play the prediction game, I have a tendency to rely on that dubious statistic we call talent. I am a big believer in the blue chip ratio, the 24/7 Sports talent composite. And the reason I believe in these numerical measurements of talent and how that translates to on-field success is because it's mostly true.
Yeah.
If you look at all the best teams in the country, they're the most talented teams on paper, almost exclusively. There are your kind of occasional outlier seasons. You have a TCU, you have, whatever. It happens. College football is fun, and that's why we love it. But the more talented team wins the game more times than they don't. Florida, on paper, is a more talented team than Utah. They have better recruits, more athletic guys at most positions. That's just a fact. You can look it up. It's real sourced information. Now, the thing about Utah is that they are one of the 2 or 3 best development programs in the entire country. Mm-hmm. So they don't recruit at that same level, but they build up their guys into like NFL caliber players, right?
Right.
The thing with that, though, is that I think Florida is getting pretty good at player development. I just have a feeling that, Billy Napier, he has a really good staff, a lot of experienced coaches who know how to recruit, know how to get the best out of some players. I mean, think about Rob Sale, the offensive line coach, right? They hired him from the New York Giants.
Yeah.
It's hard to be a position coach in the NFL. That is a high standing. That's one of the highest level jobs you can get in this sport. Mm-hmm. He's a premier guy at the offensive line position, for example. So I have faith in Florida's ability to both get better talent than a team like Utah and then develop it to its potential. Now, with that all being said, the outside factors of this game, the travel, playing on a Thursday in week 1, a night game in a difficult stadium, a lot of freshmen on the back end of the defense, like we mentioned. I will say this: if Cam Rising plays and is like 80% healthy, Utah wins. If Cam Rising doesn't play, I think Florida more likely than not will pull the upset over the Utes 2 years in a row. And I think it's really that experience factor for me, because Florida's playing behind the 8 ball in terms of the conditions, in terms of the environment. But if they're playing up against a second-tier quarterback, as opposed to one of the best guys in the entire Pac-12, which is the best quarterback conference in the country, like an experienced quarterback can pick apart a young secondary, no matter how much we believe in a guy like Devin Moore or Jakeem Jackson or all these talented players. An experienced quarterback will pick on them. It's just, that's football, especially in week 1, before those guys have seen live action. An inexperienced quarterback, a question mark quarterback, I think Florida has the advantage, and I think that'll ring true.
Yeah, I think that really is the biggest factor. Obviously, you don't want to boil it down to one position, but I really do think it comes down to that. You look at a guy like, we mentioned Jason Marshall taking this leap. Utah playing a backup quarterback. I'm not saying Jason Marshall's going to have 3 picks. He's not really that kind of player, but these are these opportunities. These young guys, they see a backup quarterback, and you say, I go out there and I play my best, and I'm able to attack this guy. That not only is going to fuel you to have a real advantage in that game, but it really gives you that confidence boost that you want to have going into the SEC schedule.
I think about a young player like Jack Pyburn or Kelby Collins just licking their chops. They see a sophomore quarterback who's played like 3 college games before, and they see, this is my opportunity to just tee off on this guy, get after him, pin my ears back, and just rush at the quarterback, go make a play, go force a fumble, be a big-time playmaker. Against a guy like Cam Rising, you have to be careful.
Yeah.
We've seen him beat Florida with his legs, make the quick throw on the run. He's that kind of guy. He's that very cerebral, very experienced. He knows what you're doing before you're doing it. The young quarterback, he doesn't have that advantage on you, and you kind of have that freedom to just go make plays. So again, like you mentioned, it's tough to boil it down. A great matchup with like 40 great players, future NFL guys all over the place in different positions.
Yeah.
To boil it down to Cam Rising, playing or not, it seems tough, but that's kind of what football is a lot of times.
Let alone the quarterback situation for any program, it's do or die. This might be.
It really can.
It could be a do or die for Utah easily. But so a little bit of a split down the middle, a little Florida, a little Utah in the predictions. But now we're away from the predictions. Something else happened in Gator Nation. The Untold story. Swamp Kings. For those who have Netflix, they had the ability to watch Untold Stories Swamp Kings, which is on Netflix, which goes into the Gators program between that of the year 2005 all the way through that of 2010. This was Tim Tebow era, Ermaya era. Mm-hmm. This was 2 national championships, a lot of SEC championships as well in the middle of that, and of course a little heartbreak, and honestly a lot of behind the stuff seen that I absolutely love seeing as a sports journalist and of course someone that enjoys sports documentaries. Now, the way I would rank it in the sense of sports documentaries I've seen and I know this is a little bit off topic, but it is top 3. I think it's right there with The Last Dance of MJ and the ESPN stuff that they did with that one during that summer of 2020. Okay. And you could also put it right there next to that, I forgot the name of it, it's also a 30 for 30 for ESPN, but the Lakers-Celtic one, where they have Ice Cube, and I think...
You ever seen Hoop Dreams?
I was going to
that one. That is a good one, too. That is
Hoop Dreams is the best. It's the best documentary ever made.
What?
This is not hyper. It is by far the best documentary ever made. It's one of the best films of the 90s. Honestly, it's probably one of the best films of all time.
Yeah, we're not talking about Soccer now. We're talking about Hoop Dreams.
I don't want to go off on a tangent. I mean, that's respectable.
No, then again, Hoop Dreams deserves to
I've seen those movies. I've seen those movies. They're good time, good movies. We just need to mention, if we're talking about the pantheon of sports documentaries, it's Hoop Dreams, Giant Gap, whatever you want.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, Hoop Dreams is good. It does follow those.
It's so good.
Pretty great. But yeah, so before I open up the discussion, I just want to say one thing. Because I grew up in South Florida, I did not watch Gator games growing up at all. And of course, through the past year or so, I've been covering this team. And there was always the conversation of, it's not like what it used to be. It's not the standard what it's at for the Gators.
Yeah.
Watching this documentary and seeing the Florida Gators, how that program was started, Urban Meyer's ethics and work, his mentality for the players, it was like complete warfare. And of course, he does have that military background from his family. But it was something where I don't even know how to describe it, but it's what SEC football used to be.
True.
And in some points, it's celebrated through the documentary, but it's also ridiculed a little bit at the end of it.
Yeah.
And especially when they talk about, Urban's, his departure from Florida, and of course the problems that he, later on, it still sticks with him when he did at Florida.
Yeah.
But I was curious, Jackson, you wrote a whole article about this on our website. What were your takes away from this documentary?
Yeah, watching this documentary, it was pretty interesting. As someone who's grown up, watching the Gators, basically since I've started following football, it was pretty interesting. These were games that I watched that, maybe I was a little too young to really comprehend. So getting that sort of game by game of this, golden era of Florida football, where they won 2 national championships, it was pretty interesting. But ultimately, I came away from the doc kind of just wanting more. In terms of actual, journalism and documentary making, I would not necessarily put it in my top 3. I don't know if I'd put it all the way in my bottom 3, but maybe somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
I definitely think it's interesting. They definitely peeled back the curtain just a little bit. Just a peek. Yeah, there was some stuff they were talking about. But I think ultimately, I was more so just kind of disappointed by not only the things they didn't talk about, but sort of the way they framed certain things.
Yeah.
I think Topher can, agree with that. Just looking at, how they were portraying certain ways, I think the biggest factor is, how much Urban Meyer is featured in the doc. Obviously, he's the head coach during that time. He is a very big key figure, maybe the second biggest key figure behind, obviously, Tim Tebow, who is arguably the most popular figure in college football.
You can make a real argument he's the best college football player of all time.
Yeah. So, it's kind of tough, but I'd say Urban Meyer is probably the second in terms of that era, in terms of just notable figures. And I feel like you could really see that he had his hand over things. And I think that sort of left opportunities where they could have talked about certain situations a lot more that they didn't necessarily go into. Obviously, Urban Meyer was able to open up about certain areas, talking about why he wasn't why he was more lenient on the team than other programs in terms of disciplining his players. He mentioned that. He went into that. But I think ultimately he left a lot on the table that could have been talked about that went on in that era.
I mean, we have a good story going into print from our sports writer Lacey that kind of goes over some of the big stories that this documentary missed. If you have been on college football Twitter for a while, you know why this documentary was made. For the last 6 years, every couple months, a tweet comes up saying this team needs a documentary because it talks about you have 35 people who've been arrested at some point or whatever the number is. I don't remember off the top of my head. All being led by the Bible thumping Christian King, Tim Tebow, and Urban Meyer's the head coach, and he's been smug with so much controversy in his career.
And I think the crazy thing about it, because he was, at least from the portion we saw, he was in Jacksonville. So some people,
Which, that's plenty of controversy right there with Jacksonville Jaguars tenure.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of that stuff is what people wanted to see.
Mm-hmm.
That's the documentary. That's the meat and potatoes of this story.
Yeah.
I think for Gator fans or people who just like college football, I think it's fun. I think it's a really good time to just reminisce and see the stories of the Tim Tebow speech after the Ole Miss loss, or Percy Harvin's performance on one ankle in the national championship game. These are great college football moments. These are great memories, great stories to tell us. But what the documentary should have been about, and what I think a lot of people, myself included, wanted it to be about was, what was going on away from the field? What were these issues, and what was that culture like that led to all these issues? Why were there all these off-the-field incidents? Why did this program collapse?
Yeah.
Basically entirely collapsed after 5 years. I think I mentioned this last week when we were talking about the show when it first came out.
Mm-hmm.
Alabama under Nick Saban is the gold standard of how to run a successful sports organization for a long time with a lot of success.
Yeah.
And the one thing you almost never hear out of Alabama, there are outliers, the one thing you almost never hear out of Alabama is serious off-the-field stuff. When they do happen, that player is gone.
Yeah.
Nick Saban is a no-nonsense guy when it comes to off-the-field shenanigans. Maybe that's not true, and he's just way better at sweeping it under the rug. I'm not an Alabama reporter. That's not my job to know.
Mm-hmm.
But from the outside looking in, that's one of the big reasons. They have such a good culture at Alabama. They just produce NFL draft picks like it's a conveyor belt. They win national championships like it's their job, and they stay out of trouble. That's why that team has been successful for 15 years in a row. In one of the most dominant eras in the entire sport, and really all of sports ever in the United States. One of the most dominant runs we've ever seen. Florida lasted 5 years. They had that type of talent. They had, arguably some of those Florida teams are some of the best college football teams ever assembled.
Yeah.
But Urban Meyer was not able to turn that into a 10-year run, a 15-year run. It's not even as successful or long-running as his Ohio State run right after this, right? So I think what the documentary needed to do more of is look critically, introspectively at that culture and what its shortcomings were, because I think that would have told us so much more about the people involved in this story and why ultimately it was a failed dynasty instead of what it was. You know what I mean? Because I think instead it looks at it as a great team. What I think the real story is that failed dynasty.
And I think the biggest part too is what was most frustrating to me watching that doc is what you just mentioned. They talked about it, but in just small doses.
Yeah, only
I remember Paul Feinbaum. He talked about it a little bit, and then obviously Urban Meyer commented it like I mentioned earlier. But then that's it, really. You have maybe 5 minutes of just talking about it, and that's really that's one of the bigger causes, is the butterfly effect of why this wasn't sustainable.
Yeah.
You go back to an earlier Florida time, those 90s under Steve Spurrier, they only won one national title, but they were really competing for the SEC championship nearly every year. Yeah.
Basically from the year he showed up to the year he left for the NFL. They were competitive in the SEC every year.
And one of the most interesting things I've thought about it, because, and again, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people out there that are Gator fans that want to, have the conversation of, did it all die off when Tebow left? Did it all die off because of Urban? Urban's health issues, of course, whether that be heart, the pressure, and from episode 4 and 3, of course, we won't be ruining everything about this documentary. But I thought the perspective of he just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
Right? But also, the way that 09 team ended off on that sour note, the locker room switched. It changed. And this documentary definitely, encased that in that episode 4. I'm more curious of the conversation of, is it Urban? Is it Tim Tebow's talent that decided, off to the NFL, and so does the rest of, the recruitment for Florida? Yeah. Or is that also Urban? Because Urban does come back, 2010, unfortunate year for the Gators that season. It was not anything of their expectations from that of 2009, let alone any bit of those championship runs they had previously. But that was one thing I took away from the documentary, the ending of it. I didn't like the ending. It did talk more about whether his time in Jacksonville. I mean, as we've also discussed, the controversy of him as a head coach, and maybe some reason why people are reluctant of even talking about him, and his time here at Florida. And in some way, the documentary did miss some points.
And I think you mentioned talking about it kind of asked the question of oh, can you just not do it anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to kind of, for the documentary to frame it potentially in that kind of way, when 2 years later, he was the head coach at one of the highest pressure jobs in the country at Ohio State, which is like a top 5 biggest job in college football. That's a pressure cooker.
Yeah, it was a championship.
Exactly. So it's an interesting framing, and I think I, as somebody who isn't like a lifelong Florida fan, I didn't grow up with Tim Tebow teams. I didn't grow up watching the Gators, so I don't have that same nostalgic side of it.
Yeah.
But so I just wanted more of that journalism and more of that. What's the through line? How did this fall apart? As opposed to this was such a great time. I think that's my main takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off what we were talking about with Nick Saban and how he's able to sustain that program for so long. I don't think it's just one thing that obviously led to the downfall of that Florida program. But I ultimately feel like a lot of it has to fall on the head coach. You're always going to see maybe some regression when you lose. A guy who is arguably maybe the greatest college football player of all time.
It's happened in Alabama a couple times.
That's what I'm saying. Like you look at Alabama. They just lost Bryce Young, who is one of, again, he's up there as one of the more talented college football players we've ever seen at quarterback, and yet people are still picking Alabama to probably win the SEC West and the whole SEC and make the playoffs, and we don't know who their starter is going to be. I look at a team like Georgia. They're going to play.
Doesn't never matter who their starter was.
They name their starter. He doesn't have much experience, if at all.
Still going to go undefeated.
And yet they're still clearly the AP number 1. You look at Ohio State. Right now, they're having a quarterback battle going on. They just lost C.J. Stroud, who's a really talented quarterback. They're another playoff favorite. So you look at these programs and they lose their quarterbacks, who maybe aren't in an argument for greatest of all time like Tim Tebow is, but they're still up there as some of the greatest quarterbacks we've seen, at least in recent memory of the 2000s, and they've still been able to sustain that success year after year after year, even if they maybe have a little bit of a down year, like slightly, maybe they lose 2 or 3 games, but that's still a successful year. You look at Florida, and sure, there's going to be some regression when you lose a guy like Tebow, but you should be able to sustain success based off the recruits you bring in year to year, and if Urban Meyer is able to develop them.
It's really that culture aspect, and I think the degradation of Urban Meyer's culture should have been the main focus. I know I've said that a couple times, but it's exactly what you're getting at. College football, more than any other sport, is not really about the players on a year-to-year basis. Like as fans, we fall in love with the players. Those are the storylines. Those are the guys making the plays, putting their bodies on the line. So we love them in the moment, but when it comes to sustaining program success, it's not about the players. Programs are not made by individual players. They're made by the coaches that are there for a long time. They're made by the standards that are set, the culture that's built. And we can even bring it back to what Billy Napier is building. We've mentioned many times that he's trying to slowly build it through recruiting classes after recruiting classes, building a consistent culture in that building. That's what college football success is about more than anything. It doesn't really matter who the individual faces are any given season. It's about sustaining that culture, sustaining that recruiting pipeline, setting a standard every year. I mean, you mentioned how this documentary shows that standard and what they set. And, the football players, when they were asked about the documentary, they mentioned that standard that those guys set. What happened? Why was that no longer the standard? Why did things fall off in 2010? Why did that culture go away, more or less, when Will Muschamp, came into the program after Meyer? So I think one last point. I know we've gone way off. I love this. This has been an awesome conversation.
Of course.
It kind of went off the point, but great talk. One last point just about what I want the documentary to be. I think it's too much a celebration of good teams and not as much an investigation on a failed dynasty and a failed Leviathan program, which Florida had the potential to be.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. But that's all the time we have for this week. Again, it was a really great conversation we had, so I really do thank you guys for joining on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, but if you are interested in more of our podcast, of course, you can find us on Spotify, of course, the Alligator Sports Podcast, as well as on our socials, whether that be X or formerly known as Twitter, or on Instagram on Alligator Sports. And we'll see you guys next week with a recap, of course, of the Utah versus Florida game upcoming this Thursday at 8 p.m. on ESPN or anything with UF Athletics. Thank you.